Maggie Jerusalem, a communications officer for the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, and I work specifically with the Civil Society program. Today I'm here with my colleague Vuyiswa Sidzumo, who is a program officer for our grantmaking in South Africa, which operates out of our Johannesburg office. Welcome, Vuyiswa.
Thank you, Maggie.
We'll start by asking Vuyiswa to describe the current state of the nonprofit sector in South Africa.
Well, the nonprofit sector in South Africa has gone through some hard times. After 1994, it was weakened because there was the so-called brain drain where a lot of the leaders left the sector to go into government. But over time, there was a new leadership that was developed, and which then helped the sector to regain some of that vibrancy that it did have before 1994. In a way, I think we still have a fairly strong nonprofit sector with good leadership, although that's still a challenge because you're finding that many people are still moving from the nonprofit sector into government once they gain the experience, which is very relevant for South Africa because many nonprofit organizations work at the local level and as a result understand the development needs of the country. So it is still a very vibrant sector and it is making a difference to the lives of many people.
And what about philanthropy in South Africa? Today it looks a lot different than it did even just 5 years ago. Can you describe the many faces of the country's indigenous philanthropy, which includes corporate foundations and also community foundations?
Mm-hmm. Yes, you're right. It has been an evolving field, starting with corporate philanthropy, which in the past only had experience in mostly charitable giving. But over time, and with a lot of, I would say, education from activists within the nonprofit sector, corporate philanthropy has been moving more towards funding developmental causes. And you have had an emergence of indigenous grant-making institutions that are established to address really various unique needs for different communities across the country. For instance, you would have a women's fund that would fund mainly women or women-led organizations at the local level that are working to address different social needs. You would have others that fund local economic development activities and so on. So that has been progressing very well. You also have the emergence of community foundations, although there are still a few of those across the country, at least those that I'm aware of. And those have taken various forms depending on the communities with which they work and where they are based. So you find that those that are based in resource-rich communities have been able to access funding from local corporates within those communities, but others are still, for instance, dependent on on foreign donor funding. But all of them have in common the fact that they work with local communities.
And when we talk about communities, one of the big programs that Mott funds in South Africa is community-based advice offices. Can you describe the role of these and also their challenges, particularly because the audience in the state is not aware or familiar with this concept of advice offices?
Mm-hmm. Advice offices provide basic legal advice to mainly poor people in the South African context, where there would be a paralegal that has been trained, that has received some basic training either through a university or another non-profit organization on just the basics of the law. So that's the primary reason for being of advice officers, to provide basic legal advice to poor people for free. But over time, these advice offices have taken on more projects and causes to address the many needs within their communities. As a result, you wouldn't find two advice offices that do exactly the same thing across the country. In fact, even within the same province sometimes. So you find that across different provinces, advice offices would address different needs. For instance, in the Western Cape, there would be a lot of labor law cases that are related to unfair dismissals of farm workers. In the Eastern Cape, you may find that there is a lot of advice offices address social issues where people are trying to access social grants from government. So these advice offices would assist people to access these various services. Their challenge mainly has been funding, because many donors have redirected their causes to have redirected their finances to other causes or to other countries, because they believe that South Africa is a middle-income country.
And yet, we still see in foundation in South Africa that there is a need to fund public participation initiatives, which the majority of funders came in after the 1994 free and fair elections, which you mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. Can you give examples of some of the civic or public participation initiatives that Mott is funding today? Mm-hmm.
The primary reason for funding public participation, I would say, is really to make democracy real for South Africans. For an example, the kinds of initiatives we fund would be where organizations work with communities and community-based organizations to assist them to understand local governance, first and foremost, how local governance works and what communities are entitled to as it relates to service delivery, because local government is where the delivery of basic services to communities happens. That would be water, sanitation, electricity, and so on. So what these organizations then do, legislation, firstly, let me mention that legislation requires local governments to have communities participate in the development of these local plans. But that doesn't always happen in an ideal way. So the organizations we support help these communities to access these platforms where they can engage with local government and participate in the development of those local plans, in the development of budgets. They also work with government officials, in fact, to sensitize them about the importance and the need of engaging and involving communities in the development of local plans.